Archive 360 News. What what did the Sparks do that you saw that you did not expect them to do tonight, coming in, that allowed them to score as many points as they did tonight?
I don't think they did anything that we didn't expect them to do. You know, I think we certainly understand how capable of a team they are. I felt like we just didn't match their energy.
How capable of a team they are. This is one of the worst teams in the league. They don't have their star.
Picture this: a franchise pays for a golden ticket, the most electrifying player college basketball has ever produced, and then proceeds to hide that ticket in a drawer, pulling it out for 90 seconds at a time before locking it away again. That is precisely what happened on the evening of July 8, 2026, inside a Los Angeles arena, when the Indiana Fever lost 106-92 to a Los Angeles Sparks team that was limping without its two most important players. What followed at the post-game podium was not an exercise in accountability. It was a masterclass in organizational misdirection, a carefully worded session in which a head coach blamed energy, a veteran guard implied certain teammates don't respect the game, and a generational talent was reduced to a talking point about reintegration. The answers given in that media room expose something far deeper than one bad night. They expose a franchise at war with itself, a team caught between the future it drafted and the past it refuses to release. On Wednesday, against the Los Angeles Sparks, Caitlin Clark returned to action for the Indiana Fever after a two-game absence. She missed their previous meetings with the Sparks and Las Vegas Aces due to a back injury she sustained on June 24 against the Phoenix Mercury. The result was a 106-92 defeat that sent shockwaves through.
Maybe you didn't get the best out of that.
Yeah, I mean, look, anytime you've missed, a couple weeks, it's going to take some time to get acclimated. I think it's going to take some time to build endurance. She hadn't really been able to practice all that much either. They pressured 94 feet, so again, you got to make sure that you're able to withstand some of that. It's never easy when you're reintegrating,
But why do we have the reason the reintegrating is such an issue? Because
the WNBA landscape, not because Indiana lost, but because of who asterisk they lost to and how the post-game narrative was constructed. The Sparks had ruled out both Kelsey Plum due to a lower left leg injury and Cameron Brink, who would miss her fifth straight game with a left ankle injury. The Los Angeles Sparks were without Kelsey Plum for at least 4 weeks, as the 31-year-old guard was dealing with an injury in her lower left leg. Plum had been their best player by a wide margin, posting a team-leading 23.9 points per game, second in the league only to reigning MVP Aja Wilson, along with 6.4 assists per game. In other words, the Sparks were a skeleton crew, missing their offensive engine and their defensive anchor. And they still won by 14. The Sparks' frontcourt dominated the paint with Nneka Ogwumike registering 24 points and 8 rebounds, and Derica Hamby putting up 19 and 9. LA totaled 106 points, which is significant for them with Kelsey Plum still out of the lineup, and every Sparks starter was in double figures. When the reporters turned their microphones on, they expected answers. What they got instead was a clinic in deflection. Stephanie White stepped to the...
It's supposed to be built around her. Like, it just doesn't make sense what this coach is doing, what this organization is doing. It's piss poor. It's a joke. It's a clown show, man. And I'm sure it's hard for somebody to get reintegrated when they're playing 90 seconds and coming out. The most the girl played was 3 minutes at one time. I get it. You're on a minutes restriction. If that is the minutes restriction and that is the plan, don't play her until she can play more minutes. It just...
Podium with the measured composure of someone who had already decided exactly which words she would and would not use. A reporter asked the most obvious question imaginable. What did the Sparks do that Indiana did not expect? White's response was revealing in what it avoided. She said that the Sparks did nothing surprising, that Indiana fully understood how capable Los Angeles was. Her diagnosis was simple. The Fever didn't match the Sparks' energy. That was it. No mention of scheme adjustments gone wrong, no admission that the game plan failed, no acknowledgement that her team just surrendered 106 points to a depleted opponent. Just energy, just effort. On the surface, it sounds like a coach holding her players accountable. But peel back one layer and the evasion becomes obvious. When a head coach loses to one of the league's most shorthanded teams and her only explanation is that her players lacked effort, she's doing one of two things. Either she genuinely doesn't see a coaching problem, which is alarming, or she sees the problem clearly and is choosing to redirect attention elsewhere, which is arguably worse. Because the real question isn't whether Indiana matched the Sparks' energy. The real question is why a coaching staff couldn't devise a game plan capable of exploiting an opponent missing...
In the front court, especially with AB out.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big one. Right, that's a big one because she's our anchor. She's our anchor. She's our communicator. She's our rim protector.
Oh, what? You got Dances. You wanted Dances, right? We're going to get to what Kelsey Mitchell had to say, too. This is ridiculous on all fronts. They feel like they don't need Caitlin Clark. It's ridiculous.
We don't have a transition defense when you give it to them and they're able to score. We don't have a transition defense when you give it to them and they're able to score. Turnovers for touchdowns, so to speak.
That she never talk about Kelsey Mitchell turnovers. She didn't sub Kelsey Mitchell out after those.
Its two best players. Energy is a vague catch-all, a word that sounds like accountability, but actually absolves every decision maker in the building except the players on the floor. Because it had been 2 weeks since Clark last played competitively, head coach Stephanie White and the Fever decided to put her on a minutes restriction during their latest showdown. Clark played just 16 minutes against the Sparks and finished with 9 points on 4 of 12 shooting, along with 4 rebounds, 3 assists, and 1 steal. 16 minutes for the franchise player in a game the team desperately needed. But the number alone doesn't tell the full story. It's how those 16 minutes were distributed that raises the most serious red flags. Clark was held to just 16 minutes in Indiana's 106-92 loss to Los Angels as the Fever carefully managed her workload. Rather than playing extended stretches, she was rotated in and out of the lineup every few minutes, making it difficult to find any offensive rhythm. Clark's first stint on the floor lasted just over 3 minutes as she was subbed out early in the first quarter with the Fever leading the Sparks 11-5. The longest stretch Clark played at any one time was roughly 3 minutes. She'd come in, touch the ball a handful of times, and then find herself back on the sideline pedaling a stationary bike. 90 seconds on, out 2 minutes, out again, 3 minutes maximum in any single stretch. This is not how you build endurance. This is not how you reintegrate a player into an offensive system. This is how you ensure that a player can never establish
job. I'm gonna do my job every day. I think that this game can't be taken for granted. You gotta respect it. You gotta pour in whatever you got into it, and give that every time. I don't think there's an excuse that you can give to do this job, and I think that I do my damnedest to make sure that I show up. If I can lace them up and I can do what I need to do, then I'm gonna do it.
Rhythm, never get comfortable, never impact the game in any meaningful way. Clark herself was bracingly honest about the experience. It's just really hard when you're playing 3 minutes, sub out 3 minutes, then you're on the bench, Clark told reporters after the game. It's really, really hard to get into a flow. For the most part, I got good looks. Some of them went, some of them didn't. I probably didn't get to have a feel for the game as I usually do. Her candor cuts through the organizational doublespeak. She's not complaining about being on a restriction. She's pointing out that the structure of the restriction is counterproductive. You don't build game conditioning with 90-second intervals. You don't develop rhythm by spending more time on a stationary bike than on the hardwood. If the organization truly believed Clark needed limited minutes to protect her back, the logical approach would have been to play her in 2 or 3 sustained stretches of 5 to 7 minutes each, allowing her to get into a rhythm while still capping her overall workload. Instead, the staccato substitution pattern ensured she could never contribute meaningfully, which then becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. She struggles because she can't find rhythm, and the struggles justify the limitation. Clark has made her disdain.
It's always disjointed, disoriented when.
Now they're going to talk about the offense, and you heard Stephanie White talk about how hard of a time it is reintegrating Caitlin Clark and all this stuff.
Do you feel like there was this sort of a little bit of a disjointedness that you guys never could quite get past?
I think flow is always disjointed, disoriented when you don't defend. I think that anything that you want to do on the offensive end, you can't do when you don't defend the ball. If you're getting the ball at the net every possession, you're going to be discombobulated. I think for us, we kind of shot ourselves in the foot because we couldn't find a decent flow offensively, but I think that's a test.
For minutes restrictions evident in the past, saying she'd rather not play than play under one. That sentiment, once viewed as competitive fire, now reads as prophetic. If the plan was to have her play 3-minute cameos, the question becomes legitimate: why play her at all? When asked about Clark's performance, White deployed a word that has become a recurring motif in Fever press conferences this season: reintegrating. Anytime you've missed a couple of weeks, it's going to take some time to get acclimated, White stated in her post-game press conference. I think it's going to take some time to build endurance. White added, "It's never easy when you're reintegrating after injury," and said she believes Clark is going to continue to be better as she gets more practice time and game reps. On the surface, these are reasonable statements. Players do need time to regain conditioning after injuries. The problem isn't the concept, it's the context. White is talking about reintegrating Caitlin Clark as if Clark is a peripheral piece being folded back into a functioning machine. But Clark isn't a role player. She's the engine. She's the reason the arena is sold out. She's the reason television ratings have skyrocketed. You don't reintegrate the engine, you rebuild the machine around it. And here's the deeper issue embedded in White's language. She mentioned almost in passing that the team runs differently depending on whether Clark is on the floor.
I think
We couldn't find a flow offensively, and you talked like you got to piece this thing together. You heard Stephanie White talk about how it's difficult to reintegrate Caitlin Clark offensively and this and that. Now you seeing Kelsey Mitchell talk about, they don't have no flow offensively and yada yada. I mean, just say y'all don't want Caitlin no more. Just say you and Stephanie White want to do y'all own thing. Just say that and let's move on. I'm tired of this.
that we had some good moments. I think that we had some moments that made it seem like we were getting back into the game, but you got to turn them into moments every single possession. After a while, we shot ourselves in the foot because then we start looking for possession.
Or not. The implication is staggering. The Indiana Fever, a team that drafted Caitlin Clark with the first overall pick, a team whose brand and revenue stream is inextricably linked to her presence, is running two separate offensive systems, one with Clark, one without. That's not load management. That's not sophisticated rotation strategy. That's a fundamental identity crisis. Championship-caliber organizations don't operate this way. When the Phoenix Mercury had Diana Taurasi, the entire system orbited around her scoring gravity. When the Seattle Storm built around Sue Bird and Breena Stewart, every possession was designed to maximize their complementary skill sets. When the Las Vegas Aces constructed their dynasty around Aja Wilson, the roster, the schemes, the entire organizational philosophy pointed in one direction, toward their franchise player. Indiana is doing the opposite.
You gotta kind of want to pour in to be what you're supposed to be, and letting the offense kind of take it from there. But I think defensively, it kind of was just ugly.
Cool. Yeah, Lexi, you mentioned the 106 points on defense. Just what was breaking down there defensively, especially in the front court with them scoring 60 in the paint?
Yeah, I mean, not having AB tonight definitely hurts us, I think. She's a presence on the defensive side for sure. But like Kelsey talked about, I think we couldn't get set up on defense with the turnovers that we had. It just kind of ruined our momentum when we turn it over and they get leak out layups. But I think like we let them do what they want to do. All their starters with over 10 points. That's something that we can't let happen. Yeah, I just didn't feel like we were that.
They're trying to maintain two parallel identities and then expressing surprise when the seams show. White's use of the word reintegrating is an accidental confession. The system isn't built for Clark, and every time she returns from even a brief absence, the coaching staff has to figure out how to shoehorn her back in. That's backwards. That's organizational malpractice. Then came Kelsey Mitchell. The veteran guard stepped to the microphone and delivered comments that sounded professional on the surface but carried unmistakable undertones beneath. Mitchell talked about showing up, about doing her job every day, about not taking the game for granted. She spoke about respecting the game and pouring everything you have into it. Taken in isolation, these are the words of a committed professional, but words don't exist in isolation. They exist in context. And the context of this press conference, a media session dominated by questions about Clark's limited minutes, her conditioning concerns, and the difficulty of reintegrating her, gives Mitchell's comments an entirely different resonance. When Mitchell says the game can't be taken for granted, the implication hangs in the air. Who is taking it for granted? When she talks about pouring everything into the game, who is she suggesting isn't doing that? She doesn't name anyone. She doesn't have to. The entire press conference has been a conversation about one player, and Mitchell's response positions herself and the other veterans as the players who show up ready regardless of circumstances, drawing an implicit contrast with a teammate who apparently needs special minutes management and careful reintegration. Then the reporter asked about offensive flow, about whether the Fever's attack looked disjointed. Mitchell's answer was instructive. Instead of addressing the offensive question directly, she immediately redirected to defense. She said it's always disjointed and disoriented when you don't defend. She said the team couldn't find a flow offensively and attributed it entirely to how poor the defense was. The redirection is notable. White had just spent several minutes explaining how difficult it is to maintain offensive continuity when you're running two different systems and reintegrating a player who hasn't practiced. Mitchell just confirmed the flow problem but attributed it to a completely different cause. Either the coaching staff's explanation about reintegration difficulties is overblown, or Mitchell is choosing to sidestep the real offensive dysfunction. Both possibilities point to the same conclusion. Nobody in this organization is on the same page about why they're struggling. The Sparks scored 60 points in the paint, 60, against a professional basketball team. That number alone represents a catastrophic defensive failure, and the explanations offered at the podium did nothing to mitigate it. With Aaliyah Boston also out due to a leg injury, the Fever suffered a 106-92 loss and dropped to 12-9 on the season. Clark wasn't the only major absence impacting Indiana. All-star forward Aaliyah Boston was unavailable because of a leg injury, leaving the Fever without one of their most consistent interior players. The Fever's starters up front, Monique Billings and Miesha Hines-Allen, combined for only 4 points total. White called Boston the team's anchor, their communicator, their rim protector. All true. Boston is a former #1 overall pick herself, a legitimate all-star caliber interior presence. Her absence was significant, but here's the question that nobody at the podium asked and nobody at the podium answered. If Boston is so critical to the defensive scheme that her absence leads to surrendering 60 points in the paint, where was the contingency plan? Injuries are inevitable in professional sports. Every team loses key players during the course of a season. The measure of a coaching staff isn't how the team performs when fully healthy, it's how they adapt when the roster is compromised. Successful coaches have backup schemes, they adjust rotations, they modify defensive assignments, they find ways to compete even when operating at less than full strength. What Indiana showed against the Sparks was a team with no plan B when Boston went down. The interior defense didn't just decline, it evaporated. And the coaching staff's response was essentially a shrug and a reference to the missing player. That's not analysis, that's an excuse dressed up as an explanation. The turnovers compounded the problem. The Fever committed 16 turnovers, and White talked about how those turnovers prevented the defense from getting set, creating what she called turnovers for touchdowns. Clark herself had 4 turnovers, while the team as a whole turned the ball over 16 times, but there was a telling asymmetry in how different players' turnovers were addressed. When discussing Clark's performance, White was granular in specific conditioning concerns, endurance-building, reintegration challenges. When discussing the team's turnover problems, she was vague and collective. No individual players were named. No specific sequences were critiqued. The contrast in specificity is itself a form of communication. Every time the Indiana Fever lose, the narrative of tension and division within the team resurfaces almost instantly. And each time it does, Coach Stephanie White and Caitlin Clark seem to carry the added burden of having to dismiss the rumors all over again. The word that keeps appearing in different forms throughout every Fever postgame this season, reintegration, flow, connectedness, rhythm, is actually one word wearing different disguises: identity. The Indiana Fever do not have one. They don't know who they are or how they want to play, and the reason is visible from orbit. This franchise is caught in a tug-of-war between two competing visions. On one side stands Caitlin Clark, the generational talent who shattered every meaningful college basketball record, who generates unprecedented ticket sales and television viewership, whose skill set demands a fast-paced, spacing-heavy, transition-oriented offensive system that maximizes her otherworldly court vision and shooting range. On the other side stand the incumbent veterans and a coaching staff with their own established philosophies, their own preferred tempo, their own ideas about what winning basketball looks like. These two visions are not merely different, they are incompatible. And rather than making the difficult but necessary organizational decision to fully commit to one direction, Indiana has tried to split the difference. They want Clark's jersey sales without Clark's basketball philosophy. They want the revenue she generates without reorganizing around her talents. The result is a team that plays two different styles depending on who's on the court. A team that talks about reintegration every time its franchise player returns from even a minor absence. A team that loses to depleted opponents and then offers a smorgasbord of excuses that implicate everyone except the decision makers. This was a flashback to a previous substitution pattern Stephanie White used at times earlier in the season to mixed results, including what became a blowout loss to the Portland Fire that made headlines. The Fever were blasted by the Portland Fire 184 in a game where Clark finished with just 6 points on 1 of 7 shooting and picked up 5 fouls in only 22 minutes. The pattern is repeating. The same substitution controversies, the same press conference deflections, the same cycle of frustration. Think about how the most successful WNBA franchises have handled comparable situations. When a team identifies a generational talent, it commits fully. It builds the roster to complement that player. It designs schemes to maximize that player's impact. It hires coaches who share that vision. It makes difficult decisions about veteran players who don't fit the new direction. These choices are uncomfortable, but they're the price of building a championship contender. Indiana has drafted the most marketable and arguably most skilled player in women's basketball history, and their response has been to play her in 90-second intervals, while their coaching staff uses words like reintegrating, and their veteran players drop veiled comments about respecting the game. It would be comical if it weren't such a colossal waste of talent and opportunity. Despite all this dysfunction, there is a paradox at the heart of the Indiana Fever's 2026 season. The Fever stand at 13-9, first in the WNBA Eastern Conference. Aaliyah Boston, Caitlin Clark, and Kelsey Mitchell were all named 2026 NBA All-Star starters. Clark was named June Eastern Conference Player of the Month. In other words, this team is winning in spite of its internal contradictions, not because of organizational harmony. Clark's talent is so immense that she elevates the team even when the system works against her. Mitchell's veteran consistency keeps the offense afloat during Clark's absences. Boston's defensive presence masks systemic flaws when she's healthy. The talent is real. The record reflects that talent. But the gap between where this team is and where it could be, that gap is entirely a product of coaching decisions and organizational ambivalence. The Fever have relied heavily on Clark's offensive creation throughout the season. Without Boston controlling the paint and Clark playing limited minutes, Indiana struggled to keep pace with Los Angels as the Sparks pulled away in the second half. The evidence is right there in every game log. When Clark plays extended minutes, the Fever are a dangerous, dynamic team. When she's limited or absent, they revert to a mediocre squad that can lose to anyone. And yet, the coaching staff continues to treat her presence as a variable rather than a constant, something to be managed and modulated rather than maximized. What makes the Sparks post-game particularly instructive is how neatly it fits into a broader pattern. Every substitution is dissected, every timeout is judged, every late injury report becomes a conspiracy. Every sideline conversation becomes body language and lip-reading analysis. That's the reality of coaching Caitlin Clark. The scrutiny is intense, perhaps unfairly so, but the scrutiny exists because the decisions keep inviting it. To be clear, there is no evidence White is trying to purposely undermine Caitlin Clark. That's an internet theory, not a fact. But there is ample evidence that White's coaching philosophy and Clark's playing style are not yet aligned, and that the organization has failed to resolve that tension in any meaningful way. This is what happens when the WNBA's biggest star gets pulled while her team is rolling. The game immediately turns, and the coach's explanation doesn't satisfy the people watching. Post-game press conferences have become a predictable ritual. The Fever lose. Reporters ask about Clark's minutes or substitution patterns. White offers clinical explanations about conditioning, load management, or defensive matchups. A veteran player makes comments that subtly distance herself from the team's struggles. Clark is honest about her frustration but careful not to throw anyone under the bus. And then everyone goes home until the next loss, when the entire cycle repeats. This is not a team moving toward resolution. This is a team stuck in a holding pattern, circling the same dysfunction endlessly, and the press conferences are the black box recording every revolution. When White mentioned that the Sparks pressure 94 feet, meaning full-court defensive pressure, she framed it as a challenge that Clark needed to build endurance to withstand. But a different coaching perspective would see that same pressure as a golden opportunity. Caitlin Clark is one of the best passers in women's basketball history. Her court vision is elite, her passing range is extraordinary, and her ability to read defenses is at a level rarely seen. Full-court pressure from an opponent missing its primary ball handler and defensive anchor isn't something you need to endure, it's something you exploit. You design plays that break the press with Clark's passing. You use her ability to see the floor to create easy transition baskets. You turn the opponent's aggression into your advantage. That's what competent coaching looks like. It's taking your best players' strengths and building a scheme that weaponizes them against whatever the opponent throws at you. Instead, White's approach was to play Clark in fragments, denying her any opportunity to settle into the game, to read the defense, to use her vision to dissect the pressure. It's the equivalent of having a world-class sprinter and then asking them to run in 10-meter bursts with rest breaks in between. You'll never see what they can actually do. According to White, the Fever want to ensure Clark can handle the physical demands of constant traps, double teams, and full-court attention before removing her minutes restriction. There is a kernel of logic here. A player returning from a back injury should be eased in, but the execution betrayed the logic. It's a careful balancing act. Indiana wants its franchise star back on the floor, but it also wants to avoid another setback during the second half of the season. The question is whether the balancing act is genuinely about Clark's health or whether it's become a convenient mechanism for managing the internal tensions that Clark's dominance creates within the roster. What makes this entire situation so painful for fans and neutral observers alike is the sheer magnitude of the opportunity being squandered. Caitlin Clark's arrival in the WNBA generated a cultural moment that the league had been waiting for since its inception. Television ratings for Fever games surged to historic levels. Arenas that had struggled to fill seats were suddenly selling out weeks in advance. Young girls across the country were wearing number 22 jerseys and dreaming of playing professional basketball. The league was experiencing a renaissance, and Caitlin Clark was the primary catalyst. The economic impact alone was staggering: merchandise sales, broadcast rights valuations, sponsorship deals, all surging on the back of one player's generational appeal. And Indiana's organizational response has been to play her in 90-second intervals, to talk about reintegration challenges, and to build a system that reportedly functions differently depending on whether she's on the court. The disconnect between the opportunity and the organizational response is almost impossible to overstate. Every game that Clark spends pedaling a stationary bike while her teammates flounder is a wasted data point, a game that should have been a showcase for the franchise player and a building block for the team's long-term identity. Instead, it becomes another evening of dysfunction, another post-game press conference full of coded language and competing narratives. The trajectory of this situation points toward an inevitable reckoning. Some claims have even gone as far as suggesting that Coach White could be fired or that Clark could be traded to the Sparks. But as Clark herself pointed out, there is a meaningful difference between speculation and substance. "I think speculation, opinions, what about reports?" she said. Clark is right to dismiss unfounded rumors, but the underlying tensions aren't rumors. They're visible in every press conference, every substitution pattern, every carefully worded answer. The facts are plain. The team runs two different systems. The coach uses language that positions the franchise player as a complication rather than a cornerstone. The veterans make comments that draw implicit contrasts between their own professionalism and their star teammates' special treatment. Something will have to give. Either the front office will recognize that the current approach is producing diminishing returns and make significant changes, whether to the coaching staff, the roster composition, or both, or the situation will continue to deteriorate until the dysfunction becomes untenable. For Indiana, the priority isn't what Clark looked like in 16 minutes against the Sparks. It's making sure she's fully prepared to handle a much heavier workload when the games matter most during the second half of the WNBA season. That's the organizational line. Whether the reality matches the rhetoric will determine the franchise's future. The most likely resolution involves one of two outcomes. Either Indiana fully commits to building around Clark, hiring or retaining coaches who embrace her style, constructing a roster designed to complement her abilities, and accepting the growing pains that come with that commitment, or Clark eventually reaches a point where she seeks a situation that actually maximizes her talents. A player of her caliber will not indefinitely accept being treated as a reintegration challenge rather than a franchise cornerstone. The July 8 loss to the depleted Sparks was not a basketball anomaly. It was a symptom made visible, a single evening that crystallized everything wrong with how Indiana is managing the most valuable asset in women's basketball. The press conference revealed a coaching staff deflecting blame through vague references to energy, a veteran guard dropping coded comments about professionalism, and a franchise player honest enough to admit that playing in 3-minute fragments makes it impossible to contribute. The word reintegrating has become Indiana's organizational tell, a verbal tick that reveals a franchise still unsure whether it wants to build around its generational talent or merely accommodate her. Until the Fever choose a direction and commit without reservation, they will continue losing games they should win, holding press conferences that explain nothing, and wasting the kind of talent that comes along once in a generation. The clock is ticking, and history will not be kind to the people who had Caitlin Clark and couldn't figure out how to use her.